When people imagine the perfect suburban neighborhood, they usually picture tidy lawns, well-kept houses, and quiet streets where kids ride their bikes without a worry in the world. At first glance, that's exactly what the narrator thought they had when they purchased their new home. The community was governed by a homeowners association, which promised order and protection of property values. At the beginning, that sounded like a good thing. After all, the HOA promised neatness, rules against junk cars, and guidelines to prevent homes from falling into disrepair. It all sounded reasonable, but as many unfortunate homeowners eventually discover, the dream of HOA living often comes with a price, and that price is usually paid in endless petty disputes. Selective enforcement of rules, and in this case, one particularly entitled neighbor, her name wasn't important, but her behavior quickly earned her the universal label everyone in the neighborhood started whispering, Karen. She wasn't technically on the HOA board, but she might as well have been. She acted as if she personally owned every square inch of the neighborhood, including property that wasn't hers. From the day the narrator moved in, she seemed determined to make their life miserable. At first, the behavior was relatively small, passive-aggressive comments about lawn length, complaints about where cars were parked, remarks about trash cans being brought in too late after collection day. It was irritating, but tolerable. After all, every neighborhood has at least one difficult neighbor. What the narrator didn't realize was that this woman's obsession with control was about to spiral into something much more serious. The real conflict started with something as simple and ordinary as a mailbox. The mailbox was nothing special, just a standard, regulation-sized box installed at the edge of the property like everyone else's. But Karen somehow decided it was her personal mission to make even this minor detail a point of contention. At first, she complained that the mailbox was too close to the property line, even though it had been inspected and approved by both the Postal Service and the HOA before the narrator had even moved in. When that failed, she shifted her angle, insisting that the color of the post didn't match the community aesthetic, even though half the neighborhood had posts in slightly different shades. Again, her complaint went nowhere. Losing these small battles only seemed to fuel her bitterness. Over the next few weeks, Karen escalated in a way that left no doubt, this wasn't about rules or aesthetics. This was about control. The turning point came one morning when the narrator walked outside and found Karen's car parked directly in front of their mailbox. It wasn't just an occasional oversight, it became a daily habit. She would deliberately park her vehicle in a way that blocked access, making it impossible for the postal worker to deliver mail. According to USPS policy, if the mailbox is blocked, the carrier is not required to deliver. That meant important letters, bills, and packages were suddenly being held back at the post office. At first, the narrator tried to assume it was accidental. Maybe she didn't realize the problem. Maybe she wasn't aware that blocking the mailbox was preventing deliveries. But those excuses quickly disappeared when the narrator noticed the smirk on Karen's face as she watched from her window while the mail truck slowed in front of the blocked box, paused, and then drove away. She knew exactly what she was doing. It wasn't long before this petty harassment started creating real problems. Delayed mail meant late bills, important documents didn't arrive on time. Packages that should have been delivered to the doorstep ended up sitting at the post office for days. Complaints to the HOA went nowhere. The board claimed it wasn't within their jurisdiction because the street was technically public, not private. Complaints to the local police resulted in little more than a shrug. They argued that as long as she wasn't parked illegally, they couldn't do much. The Postal Service confirmed they couldn't deliver if the mailbox was blocked, but they also couldn't force a neighbor to stop parking in front of it. Karen had found the perfect loophole. She could torment her neighbor endlessly without technically breaking a single law. At this point, frustration turned into determination. The narrator wasn't just going to sit back and accept defeat. If Karen wanted to play petty games, then it was time to fight back. But this fight couldn't be approached head-on. After all, direct confrontation would only give her more fuel for her drama. What was needed was something smarter, something that would turn her own tactics against her. The seed of an idea started forming the day the narrator overheard Karen bragging to another neighbor about how convenient her mailbox was. She lived just a few houses down, and her box sat right at the edge of her property, easily accessible from her driveway. Every morning, she would casually stroll out in her robe and slippers, grab her mail, and head back inside. It was one of the few luxuries she seemed to genuinely enjoy, an effortless daily ritual that cost her no time at all. That's when the thought occurred, if Karen was going to make it impossible for someone else to access their mailbox, maybe it was time to make her mailbox just as inconvenient as she had made theirs. Not through childish vandalism or illegal acts, but through something clever, legal, and impossible for her to fight against. But before any plan could be put in motion, the narrator needed to fully understand the rules. They spent hours researching USPS regulations, HOA bylaws, and even city ordinances about mailbox placement. It turned out there were very specific requirements about accessibility, safety, and clearance. If a mailbox was deemed inaccessible, whether by design or obstruction, the Postal Service had the authority to require its relocation. And if it wasn't relocated voluntarily, delivery could be suspended entirely. Suddenly, the narrator realized they might have exactly the leverage they needed. If Karen wanted to play games with blocked mail, then maybe she would end up with no choice but to deal with her own daily inconvenience. Of course, pulling this off wouldn't be easy. It would take patience, timing, and a little bit of strategy. But if it worked, the end result would be poetic justice. The same woman who had forced someone else to go out of their way for mail would soon find herself walking much farther than a few steps from her driveway. For now, the narrator kept their cards close to their chest. They continued documenting every single time Karen's car blocked their mailbox. Photos, timestamps, and delivery failures were all carefully logged. The more evidence they gathered, the stronger their case would be when the time came. And while the frustration of missed mail continued to sting, the thought of eventual revenge kept them going. The battle lines had been drawn. What started as a simple act of entitlement was about to turn into a neighborhood showdown. And little did Karen know, her smug satisfaction was only fueling the very plan that would turn her daily routine upside down, as weeks turned into months. The narrator's patience paid off. Their evidence was undeniable. Now all that remained was to set the plan into motion, a plan that would transform the petty inconvenience of blocked mail into a daily nightmare for the one person who thought she was untouchable. The stage was set. The research was done. The next chapter in this battle was about to begin. Once Karen realized that blocking the mailbox got under her neighbor's skin, her behavior escalated. What had started as an occasional inconvenience became her daily ritual. Every morning, she would deliberately park her car in front of the mailbox, sometimes leaving it there for hours, sometimes overnight. On days when the postal truck made its rounds, she would watch from behind her curtains, sipping her coffee, waiting for the moment the carrier paused and then drove away without delivering. The smug look on her face told the whole story. This wasn't accidental, it was deliberate harassment. It didn't take long for the impact to spread beyond inconvenience. Missing utility bills meant late fees. Packages containing important documents were delayed. Even small things, like birthday cards from family, never arrived on time. Life's little joys and necessities were being interrupted by one person's selfishness. Neighbors started noticing too. Some whispered that they'd also had problems with Karen. She had complained about one family's trampoline being an eyesore, reported another household's basketball hoop to the HOA, and even tried to dictate when people could mow their lawns. Everyone disliked her, but few wanted to take her on directly. Confronting her usually resulted in endless arguments, threats of HOA complaints, or even calls to the police for fabricated grievances. She thrived on conflict, and most people chose peace over a fight, but the narrator wasn't willing to surrender. The mailbox issue wasn't just annoying, it was principle. If Karen could block mail without consequence, what would stop her from escalating even further? The narrator's first step was documentation. Every single day, they took photos of her car parked in front of the mailbox. They logged the times mail wasn't delivered, the dates packages were delayed, and even kept receipts from late fees caused by missing bills. By the end of the month, they had a small binder full of evidence. The next step was reporting. With all the documentation in hand, the narrator reached out to the Postal Service. The local postmaster confirmed what had already been suspected. Postal workers were not required to deliver to blocked mailboxes, and if the obstruction was consistent, the Postal Service could issue a demand that the mailbox be moved to a more accessible location. The catch was that the obstruction had to be proven consistent and deliberate, not just occasional. That was exactly what the narrator had gathered, proof of consistency. When the complaint was filed, an inspector from the Postal Service actually drove by the neighborhood to see the situation firsthand. And as fate would have it, Karen's car was once again parked directly in front of the mailbox during that visit. The inspector snapped his own photo, added it to the file, and confirmed the obvious: the mailbox was inaccessible on a regular basis. The ball was rolling. but Karen wasn't done. In fact, when she received word that a complaint had been filed, she doubled down. Instead of only blocking the mailbox occasionally, she now went out of her way to do it daily, sometimes repositioning her car multiple times to make sure it was perfectly centered in front of the box. She even bragged loudly to another neighbor that she was teaching someone a lesson about how this neighborhood really works. This was exactly the kind of arrogance that would undo her. The narrator's frustration grew, but so did their patience. They knew the more Karen flaunted her behavior, the stronger their case would be. And meanwhile, the research continued. Late nights were spent combing through USPS regulations, HOA guidelines, and city ordinances. The narrator learned about clearance rules, setback requirements, and, most importantly, the process for enforcing relocation of a mailbox deemed inaccessible. What they discovered was golden. If a mailbox was repeatedly blocked or obstructed, the Postal Service could issue a notice requiring the homeowner to relocate their own mailbox to a spot approved by USPS. If the homeowner refused, mail delivery would be suspended indefinitely. In other words, Karen was unknowingly digging her own hole. By trying to inconvenience her neighbor, she was setting herself up for a daily nightmare. As the weeks dragged on, the narrator began imagining the sweet satisfaction of seeing Karen's smug routine disrupted. The thought of her having to walk much farther, perhaps even out of the neighborhood, to retrieve her mail became the motivation to endure the ongoing frustration. Finally, the evidence reached a tipping point. The Postal Service, armed with the complaint file and photos, issued an official notice. It stated that the mailbox at the narrator's address was considered obstructed by a third-party vehicle on multiple occasions. But in the process of investigating, they had also noted other accessibility issues in the neighborhood, including, ironically, Karen's own mailbox. Her box sat on a curve in the road, making it more vulnerable to obstructions and less safe for delivery vehicles to stop. The letter was clear: unless changes were made to improve accessibility, several mailboxes in the neighborhood, including Karen's, would need to be relocated to a centralized cluster box further down the street. The narrator could hardly believe it. Not only was their problem being addressed, but Karen's arrogance had triggered a broader review that put her mailbox directly in the crosshairs. When Karen received the notice, her reaction was explosive. She stormed around the neighborhood, waving the letter, accusing people of conspiring against her, and insisting she would fight this to the end. She even tried to rally the HOA, demanding that they intervene. But the HOA's hands were tied. Mail delivery was a federal matter, and the USPS had final authority. Her smug morning routine of casually grabbing her mail was about to end. And the best part? It wasn't even the narrator who forced it, it was her own behavior, documented and confirmed, that had led to the decision. But Karen wasn't going down without a fight. If she couldn't control the mailbox situation, she would find other ways to lash out. Over the following days, she began filing bogus complaints with the HOA about the narrator's lawn, garbage bins, and even noise disturbances that never happened. It was clear she was spiraling, desperate to regain control. What she didn't realize was that every petty complaint only added fuel to the fire. Each false accusation was another piece of evidence of her harassment, another example of her obsession with control. And when combined with the Postal Service's order, it painted a very clear picture. Karen wasn't just a difficult neighbor, she was a menace. The narrator remained calm, patient, and focused. They knew the real revenge wasn't in yelling, arguing, or stooping to her level. The real revenge was in watching her suffer the exact inconvenience she had inflicted on others, only magnified. And soon enough, that day would come. When the Postal Service announced the relocation order, the neighborhood buzzed with gossip. A new centralized mailbox cluster was being planned at the far end of the subdivision, nearly a mile from Karen's front door. For most residents, it was mildly inconvenient but manageable. They could drive by and pick up their mail on their way in or out. But for Karen, who had always prided herself on her mailbox being just a few steps away, it was a devastating blow. The irony was almost too perfect. Her obsession with blocking someone else's box had triggered the review, and now she was the one who would have to suffer. It wasn't immediate. Projects like this take time, but the order was official. The cluster box would be installed within weeks, and once it was operational, the old curbside mailboxes would be decommissioned. While the project was underway, the narrator kept their cool. They didn't brag. They didn't gloat. They simply waited, knowing that the best revenge was watching her undo herself. Karen, on the other hand, spiraled further. She filed appeal letters to the Postal Service, wrote angry emails to the HOA, and even threatened to sue. But each attempt fell flat. The regulations were clear, the evidence was undeniable, and no amount of shouting could undo the decision. When construction began on the new cluster box, Karen's meltdown reached new levels. She confronted the workers, accused them of trespassing, and even stood in the road to try to block their trucks. Her antics were reported, and eventually, law enforcement had to warn her that interference with federal workers could result in charges. That quieted her, for a while. Finally, the day came. The new mailbox cluster was complete. Each resident was assigned a locked compartment with a key. No more curbside delivery. No more easy strolls to the edge of the driveway. From that day forward, Karen would have to make the walk, or drive, the same way everyone else did, but here's where the true revenge came in. Karen didn't drive often. She prided herself on being eco-friendly and insisted on walking most places. She would brag about her morning routine, grabbing coffee, checking her mail, and enjoying the fresh air. Only now, instead of a 30-second walk, it was nearly a mile round trip just to fetch the mail. The first week was comical. Neighbors watched as she trudged down the street in her slippers, scowling the whole way. The same woman who had once gloated about teaching a lesson was now the one suffering daily inconvenience. And because the change applied to the whole neighborhood, she couldn't single out anyone for blame without looking ridiculous. The narrator, meanwhile, enjoyed the poetic justice in silence. Every time they picked up their mail from the new cluster, they smiled knowing that Karen's petty games had backfired spectacularly, but the sweetest moment came a few weeks later. A neighbor mentioned seeing Karen struggling with several large packages at the cluster box. Instead of having them delivered to her door, she had to haul them all the way back home on foot. Red-faced, sweating, and muttering angrily, she was living out the consequences of her own behavior. In the months that followed, life in the neighborhood grew quieter. Without her morning routine to fuel her sense of superiority, Karen seemed deflated. She still complained, of course, people like her never stopped completely, but the sharp edge of her control had dulled. She couldn't intimidate anyone with HOA threats anymore, not after it became clear that her own behavior had brought the cluster box into existence. Neighbors began to talk more openly about their experiences with her. Stories of harassment, false complaints, and petty behavior circulated. For the first time, people weren't afraid to stand up to her. The mailbox fiasco had exposed her as someone who wasn't powerful, but pitiful. The narrator didn't need to lift a finger. Karen had built her own prison, and every step she took on that long walk was another reminder that she had lost. In the months that followed, life in the neighborhood grew quieter. Without her morning routine to fuel her sense of superiority, Karen seemed deflated. She still complained, of course, people like her never stopped completely, but the sharp edge of her control had dulled. She couldn't intimidate anyone with HOA threats anymore, not after it became clear that her own behavior had brought the cluster box into existence. Neighbors began to talk more openly about their experiences with her. Stories of harassment, false complaints, and petty behavior circulated. For the first time, people weren't afraid to stand up to her. The mailbox fiasco had exposed her as someone who wasn't powerful, but pitiful. The narrator found a sense of peace. Their mail was delivered without issue. Bills arrived on time. Packages were secure in the locked cluster. And best of all, every time they saw Karen walking that long stretch down the street, it was a reminder that justice had been served, not through shouting, not through fighting, but through patience, persistence, and a clever use of the rules. One neighbor even joked that Karen's daily walks were the healthiest thing that had ever happened to her. Perhaps, in a twisted way, the situation had even improved her life, though she would never admit it. The real victory wasn't just personal. It was symbolic. It showed that entitlement and arrogance don't always win. That there are ways to outsmart even the most persistent bullies. And it reminded the entire neighborhood that sometimes, the best revenge is simply letting someone trip over their own ego. Karen's story became a cautionary tale. Whenever a new neighbor moved in and asked about the mailbox cluster, someone would inevitably tell the story of the woman who blocked her neighbor's mail until the whole system changed. The tale spread, half as a joke, half as a warning, don't be the next Karen, and so, life went on. The lawns were mowed, the trash bins rolled in and out, the kids played in yard.